Justice Comes Knocking, narrated by Samuel Johnson. Introduction. Hello, I'm Samuel Johnson, a Charleston local who's witnessed this city's highs and lows. Today, I'll lead you through every metal detector beep and each heartbeat on the courthouse's marble steps. You won't just see the surface event, you'll feel the emotions, the hidden thoughts, and the secrets behind a judge's confident smile. Get ready, this story will pull you into a whirlwind of justice like nothing you've ever experienced. It starts like any ordinary day, or so it seems. But beneath the surface, something darker is brewing. When a power-hungry cop thinks he can stop, harass, and humiliate the wrong black man, he makes the mistake of his life. Because this man isn't just anybody. He's the one person who can bring the whole system crashing down around them. What follows is a battle between corruption and truth, between those who abuse their power and those who refuse to be broken. And trust me, you won't believe how this story ends. So, grab a seat, turn the volume up, and tell us what time it is, where you're watching and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We read everyone. Part 1. The Confrontation. The evening air in Eagles Crossing, Tennessee hung thick with humidity on July 17, 2022. It was supposed to be just another peaceful evening in this quiet little town where the biggest excitement most days came from the church bake sale or high school football game. The sun had started to dip behind the century-old oak trees that lined Magnolia Street, casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawns. Porch lights flickered on in sequence like fireflies awakening, and the scent of fresh-cut grass mingled with the aroma of backyard barbecues. Eagles Crossing population 8. 724 felt like the kind of place where nothing bad ever really happened. At least that's what the welcome sign promised at the town limits. Eagles Crossing, where good people make great neighbors. The casual observer might believe it. Elijah Mercer walked those streets that night, breathing in that small-town calm. A man in his mid-50s, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that came from decades of fighting battles in courtrooms, where he was often the only black face present. The slight graying at his temples caught the last glow of daylight, his dark skin a rich contrast against the crisp white collar of his shirt. The sharp cut of his tailored navy blue suit set him apart from the flannel shirts and denim jeans that dotted the sidewalks. He wasn't just visiting family, he was visiting history. Coming back to the roots where his ancestors once toiled and fought for every scrap of respect. His great-grandfather had worked these very lands, first as a slave, then as a sharecropper after emancipation facts not mentioned in the town's quaint historical markers. On one hand, Elijah carried a leather briefcase, the kind that had seen the inside of more federal courtrooms than most folks in that town had ever dreamed of. Inside were case files of real, weighty matters involving corrupt officials who thought themselves above the law. But tonight, he wasn't here for that. Tonight was about dinner with his Aunt Laverne, her famous fried catfish and sweet tea, and catching up on old stories beneath her creaky porch swing. As Elijah strolled down Main Street, his mind wandered. He thought about the case he'd been working on back in Washington, a tangled web of corruption and power abuse that was close to breaking wide open a case involving 3 senators and millions in misappropriated funds. For a few days, he'd left all that behind. Eagles Crossing was supposed to be a breath of fresh air, but not everyone saw Elijah that way. The police cruiser pulled up slowly behind him, one of those older Crown Victorias, paint chipping at the fenders. The Eagles Crossing Police Department shield faded on the door. The engine gave a low growl as it crept along the curb, tires crunching over fallen acorns. Elijah heard it but kept walking, eyes forward, footsteps steady. Years of experience had taught him exactly what to do in moments like these. Stay calm, remain dignified, show no fear. Hey! Came the bark from the driver's seat, sharp enough to slice through the quiet evening. Elijah stopped, turned slowly. His face stayed calm, but his stomach tightened. He knew that tone, had heard it in courtrooms, in hallways of power, on streets from D.C. to Atlanta. It was the sound of authority questioning his very right to exist in a space. The cop stepped out white, about 40, broad-shouldered with that buzz cut that seemed to scream authority. His uniform was pressed, but there was a coffee stain on the breast pocket. His name tag read, Officer Bradley Kane. His pale blue eyes squinted hard, sizing Elijah up like he was a question that didn't belong on his test. "Evening," Officer Elijah said, voice steady, polite. The kind of tone you learn after decades of navigating rooms where your skin color enters before you do. Kane didn't smile, he didn't even nod. The street light caught the edge of his badge, making it gleam for a moment. "You from around here?" Elijah gave the officer a polite smile, the same one he'd given to hostile witnesses and opposing counsel, visiting family. "My aunt lives just a few blocks down on Sycamore." But Kane wasn't interested in pleasantries. His hand hovered near the holster on his hip, that badge glinting in the fading sun like it gave him permission to judge the world. "Mind telling me where you're coming from?" Elijah took a slow breath. "Measured. Dinner at my aunt's place. Just headed back to my hotel." Kane's lips twisted, and that's when the shift happened. The one you feel deep in your gut, when you know a situation is about to turn. Kane stepped closer, boots scraping against the sidewalk. "Tall black male in a navy suit fits the description of a robbery suspect from 2 streets over," he said, voice dripping with suspicion. "I'm going to need to see some ID." Elijah's jaw clenched. He'd heard that line before, too many times. The vague descriptions that always seemed to fit him no matter where he went. But he stayed calm, reaching into his inside pocket and slowly pulling out his wallet. "Here you go, officer, Elijah Mercer." Kane barely glanced at it before barking again. "Hands where I can see them. Put them on the hood of the car." Elijah froze. This wasn't about ID anymore. His heart thudded against his ribs, but his voice stayed level. "Officer Kane, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm walking home. You've got no probable cause to detain me." But that just made Kane's jaw tighten. His hand twitched near his holster, and his eyes narrowed like he was just daring Elijah to push back. "You match the call." "That's probable cause enough," Kane snapped. Neighbors started to peek out from their porches. Phones lifted, recording. Elijah saw them. He'd been in this kind of spotlight before, but being a federal prosecutor didn't matter here. Here, he was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. "I know my rights," Elijah said, voice clipped but calm. "I'm not resisting, but I won't comply with an unlawful stop." Kane's face flushed red. His authority was questioned, his power was threatened, and that's when the fuse lit. "Turn around now, boy," Kane snarled. The word boy hit like a slap, sharp and familiar. Elijah's fists clenched, but he kept his hands up. "I am asking for your supervisor," Elijah pressed. But Kane had already decided. He lunged, grabbing Elijah's arm, wrenching it behind his back. The briefcase tumbled to the ground, scattering papers across the sidewalk like the pieces of a dignity Kane was intent on breaking. Cold steel snapped around Elijah's wrists, biting into his skin. His shoulder ached as Kane shoved him toward the cruiser. "You're making a mistake," Elijah said, the words even but edged with steel. But Kane just sneered. "We'll see about that." As the cruiser's back door slammed shut behind him, Elijah's eyes burned not with fear but with fire. He knew this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Because Elijah Mercer wasn't just any man. And Officer Kane had just arrested the wrong one. Part 2. Behind Closed Doors. The steel door of that police cruiser clanged shut behind Elijah Mercer, and in that moment the quiet streets of Eagles Crossing seemed like a lifetime away. The hum of the engine vibrated beneath him as Officer Bradley Kane slid behind the wheel, his jaw set like concrete, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds to glare at Elijah, caged behind that mesh partition. Inside that cruiser, something shifted in the atmosphere. Kane wasn't just arresting a suspect, he was putting a man he saw as uppity back in his place. I could tell you what was visible. The tight handcuffs cutting into Elijah's wrists, the contemptuous glances from Kane, but what you couldn't see was the calculation happening in Elijah's mind. While most men might have pleaded or protested, Elijah was cataloging every detail, every procedural violation. The lack of Miranda rights, the absence of probable cause, the excessive force. He'd prosecuted mob bosses, dirty politicians, and even law enforcement officers. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, he was just another black man in cuffs riding through the back streets of a town that had already made up its mind about him. Kane's fingers tapped the steering wheel, agitated. You could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from summer asphalt. The cruiser turned off Main Street. the wheels crunching over gravel as they pulled into the police station's back load-a-squat beige building that hadn't seen an update in years. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips like old scabs, and the American flag out front dropped on a rusted pole. Kane yanked open the cruiser door and grabbed Elijah's arm roughly, dragging him out like yesterday's trash. "Let's go, Mercer," Kane muttered through clenched teeth. Elijah straightened his back, meeting Kane's glare with a steady gaze. He didn't resist, didn't give the man the satisfaction of a struggle, but there was steel in his spine. The kind of fortitude forged through years of fighting battles in courtrooms and boardrooms where he was often the only black face present. Kane led him inside through a narrow hallway that smelled of mildew and cheap coffee. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly pallor across the faded linoleum floors as other officers glanced up from their desks. Some raised an eyebrow, others looked away. Elijah recognized the look of slight smirk from the officers who thought they had another one caught, another black man in the system, another case number. But none of them knew who he really was. Not yet. Kane pushed him toward the booking desk where a weary-looking sergeant sat behind a cracked computer monitor, chewing gum like it was the only thing keeping him awake. The nameplate on his desk read SGT. Davis, though the D was hanging by a thread. The sergeant barely glanced up, his eyes bloodshot from what smelled like more than just fatigue. "Got a live one here," Kane announced, his voice carrying that edge of satisfaction. "Fits the description of a robbery suspect from earlier." Elijah's voice stayed calm but cut through the air like a knife. "This is unlawful. You've got nothing." No evidence, no witness, no cause. The sergeant lazily popped his gum, still not looking up. "Yeah, save it for the judge." Kane smirked and shoved Elijah forward. "Let's get those prints." Elijah's breath stayed steady, though his heart raced beneath his suit. "I suggest you run my name first," Elijah said. "Voice even. It might save you a whole lot of embarrassment." Kane leaned in close, the sour scent of coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "What's that supposed to mean?" Elijah lifted his chin. "Elijah Mercer, Federal Prosecutor, Department of Justice." For the first time, the sergeant's gum froze mid-pop. He turned his head, eyes narrowing as they finally focused on the man in handcuffs. Behind him, another officer who had been filling out paperwork looked up sharply. Kane barked out a laugh, waving a hand like it was all some big joke. "Nice try." "Never heard of you." "Running the name," Elijah responded, each word measured and distinct. The tension crackled through the room like static. The sergeant hesitated, but with Kane glaring over his shoulder, he typed the name into the system. The computer whirred, the ancient fan inside grinding like it was chewing gravel. A few seconds passed. Then the sergeant's eyes widened just a flicker, but it was enough. Kane leaned forward. "What?" The sergeant cleared his throat. "It says here, he's a federal prosecutor. DOJ." Kane's face flushed a deep red. He snapped toward Elijah, his lips curling, but his eyes now held something new. Fear. Elijah raised his cuffed hands, the steel biting into his wrists, and leaned forward slightly. "I told you, and you're going to answer for this." Kane's jaw worked, grinding down hard, but the damage was done. The air in that station grew heavier as other officers stole glances at the screen, then at Kane, then back to Elijah. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. "That doesn't change a thing," Kane growled, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You're still under suspicion." Elijah narrowed his gaze, his voice low but sharp. "No, officer. I'm under attack. And you're about to learn exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong man." Kane grabbed Elijah's arm again, harder this time, yanking him toward a holding cell at the back of the station. The sergeant opened his mouth as if to protest, but Kane's glare shut him down. The other officers watched silently, none willing to step in. The metal door groaned as it swung open, and Elijah was shoved inside. The cell smelled like sweat and cold concrete, 10 feet by 10 feet of suffocating space. A thin mattress stained with God knows what lay on a metal frame bolted to the wall. The door slammed shut behind him with a hollow thud that echoed through the walls. Elijah stood there, breathing slow, steady. His wrists burned, his shoulders throbbed, but his mind raced. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Kane thought he'd caught nobody, that this was going to be just another routine arrest he could sweep under the rug. But Elijah Mercer wasn't just anybody. The wheels of justice were about to turn, and Officer Kane had thrown himself right into their path. As Elijah sat on that hard bench, he thought back to his Yale Law School days to Professor Michaels, who always said, "The law isn't just what's written. It's who writes it, who enforces it, and who's brave enough to challenge it." Tonight, in this cell, Elijah would plan how to challenge not just one bad cop, but an entire system that had enabled him. Meanwhile, in the station's break room, Kane was already on the phone with Sheriff Linda Rowe, his voice low and urgent. "We might have a situation." "Yeah, the guy claims he's in the Justice Department." "I know. I thought he was bluffing too. What do we do now?" On the other end of the line, Sheriff Rowe leaned back in her office chair, a cold weight settling in her stomach. She built her 20-year career in Eagles Crossing by keeping problems buried, by making sure the right people stayed in power. And now, this. "Keep him there," she said finally. "I'll make some calls." And Bradley? Not a word to anyone else. As she hung up, Sheriff Rowe stared at the commendations hanging on her office wall, plaques and certificates proclaiming her dedication to justice. The irony wasn't lost on her as she reached for her Rolodex, flipping to the card of Judge Holloway, a man who owed her more favors than either would ever admit publicly. The night settled over Eagles Crossing like a blanket, but underneath, the gears of a broken system were already turning, desperate to contain what was coming. Part 3. The Reckoning Begins. The morning air in Eagles Crossing carries that weight you feel just before a storm breaks, a kind of heaviness that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Folks went about their day, sipping coffee on front porches, nodding to neighbors they'd known for decades, but there was a hum beneath it all, a tension they couldn't name yet. Inside the courthouse, that tension thickened like smoke. The walls were paneled in old wood, the kind that had soaked up too many years of small-town judgments, too many stories that never made it past these walls. Black and white portraits of former judges, all white men, stared down from frames yellowed with age, watching as another case moved through their sacred halls. The courtroom wasn't built for spectacle. It was built for order, for control. But that morning, control was about to slip through Judge Thomas Holloway's fingers like sand. Elijah Mercer sat at the defendant's table, his back straight, his hands resting calmly on the wood. His suit was still sharp, though the cuffs from the night before had left faint red rings on his wrists like crimson bracelets. His eyes stayed focused on the judge's bench, waiting, not pleading, not explaining, waiting. Officer Bradley Kane stood on the opposite side of the room, posture stiff, chin high. His uniform was pressed crisp, but his eyes betrayed him, darting back and forth between Elijah and the crowd beginning to gather in the gallery. Small-town folks curious to see the latest drama unfold. A black man was arrested the night before for suspicion of robbery. Of course they'd come to watch, but what they didn't know was that this wasn't going to be the story they expected. By now, word had started to spread, whispered conversations at Dolly's Diner, hushed phone calls between neighbors. "Did you hear they arrested some big-shot lawyer from D.C.? I heard he works for the government." The rumors grew with each telling, but the truth was far more explosive than gossip could capture. The judge entered a middle-aged man with graying hair and a gavel that looked like it had never been slammed harder than it needed to be. Judge Thomas Holloway, third-generation jurist, decorated Vietnam veteran, and a man who owed his position to the right connections and the right friends. He sat down, eyes sweeping over the courtroom, pausing when they landed on Elijah. Something flickered there. Recognition, maybe. Or maybe it was just the same doubt that everyone else carried. The bailiff called the case number, his voice echoing through the hushed room. "Case number 22, CR 4587, Eagles Crossing versus Elijah Mercer." Kane stepped forward, voice steady, rehearsed. "Your Honor, we have here, Mr. Elijah Mercer, detained last night on suspicion of robbery." Elijah's voice cut in, smooth as silk, but sharp enough to slice the room in two. "Your Honor, before this circus continues, I believe it's only fair that the court understands exactly who's standing before them." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You'll get your chance, Mr. Mercer." But Elijah wasn't waiting. His hand reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, slow and deliberate, and pulled out his identification, the gold badge and credentials of a federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice. He held it up, letting the light catch the emblem, letting every pair of eyes in that room see it for what it was. I am Elijah Mercer, federal prosecutor DOJ, and I've been unlawfully detained. The judge leaned forward, his face palming a shade, eyes flicking between the badge and Elijah's face. Cain's jaw clenched so hard you could almost hear his teeth grinding. His knuckles whitened as he stared at that badge like it was something obscene. Whispers rippled through the courtroom gallery, a wave of confusion, then shock. Phones came out. Someone was already live streaming. Elijah kept his gaze steady on the judge. I'd like to request my immediate release, and that this court recognize the violation of my rights. The judge's gavel came down, but it wasn't with the kind of finality that usually ended discussions. No, this was softer, almost uncertain. Officer Cain, the judge said, voice tightening. Were you aware of Mr. Mercer's identity at the time of arrest? Cain's face flushed crimson. No, Your Honor. His credentials weren't presented until after the fact. Because they weren't required, Elijah leaned forward, voice calm, but edged with steel. I wasn't doing anything that should have warranted this stop, much less an arrest. I asked for specifics. I asked for probable cause. I asked for a supervisor. What I got instead was aggression, humiliation, and a night in a cell. The judge swallowed hard. He knew the weight of what had just dropped into his courtroom. This wasn't some minor local dispute anymore. This was federal. This was about to blow up far beyond the borders of Eagles Crossing. I want to see the arrest report, the judge said quietly. Cain fumbled with his folder, flipping through papers that felt suddenly flimsy in his hands. The courtroom stayed quiet, but the weight of judgment shifted. The people watching the judge, even the officers standing along the wall, weren't just looking at Elijah like a suspect anymore. They were seeing something different. A man who'd walked into their town with the full power of the law behind him. And they'd treated him like a criminal for the color of his skin. The judge reviewed the report, his frown deepening with each page. This is the preliminary arrest report, the judge muttered aloud. But his eyes didn't lift from the paper. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, no evidence beyond the claim that Mr. Mercer fit the description. He looked at Cain, and his face hardened just enough to show the cracks in his authority. That's a pretty thin justification, officer. Cain bristled, his fists balling at his sides. With all due respect, Your Honor, he matched the description. Tall black male in a suit. Tall black male in a suit. Elijah cut in sharp but measured. That's all it takes. The judge rapped his gavel once, not to silence Elijah, but to calm the tension. But it was too late for calm. The courtroom was wide awake now, given the lack of evidence, and Mr. Prescience by 10. Mercer's verified identity as a federal prosecutor. I'm dismissing these charges. Mr. Mercer, you're free to go. The words hung in the air for a beat, then dropped like a hammer. Elijah didn't move right away. He sat there, hands folded, letting the room take it all in, letting Cain stew in the weight of his mistake. The people in the gallery didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The silence in that courtroom spoke louder than any applause. It was the quiet of a revelation of seeing something they'd always known existed but never acknowledged openly. The unfairness, the bias, the broken system. Finally, Elijah stood, smoothing the front of his suit jacket, his wrists still bearing the faint red marks from the handcuffs. He gathered his things, his briefcase, his dignity, and walked toward the courtroom doors. As he passed Cain, their eyes met. Cain tried to hold that stare, tried to summon whatever authority he had left, but it didn't last. Elijah's eyes cut through him steady, unflinching. I'll be seeing you again, Officer Cain, Elijah said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. But next time, it'll be in a different courtroom. Cain's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Elijah pushed open the door and stepped out into the sunlight, leaving behind the weight of that room but carrying something far heavier on his shoulders. Because this wasn't the end, not even close. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It wasn't just about walking out free. It was about making sure that what happened in that courtroom that almost happened to him never happened again. At Officer Cain, he just set something in motion he couldn't control. Part 4. The Gathering Storm. When Elijah Mercer stepped out of that courthouse, the Tennessee sun felt different on his skin. Warmer, sharper. The light caught on the gold seal of his federal ID as he tucked it back into his jacket pocket, the faint red marks from those handcuffs still raw around his wrists. He stood there for a moment, taking in the scene of small-town streets, the courthouse's brick facade, the crowd that had followed the morning's hearing, now gathered in knots outside. Their voices hushed but buzzed. Whispers had already started to ripple through Eagles Crossing. Elijah Mercer, federal prosecutor. Can you believe it? They arrested him like some thug. Phones were out, faces turned toward him, some watching with curiosity, others with suspicion. But Elijah walked forward, steady and unbothered. He knew this wasn't the end of it, not for Officer Kane, not for this town, and certainly not for him. Because stories like these, they don't stay quiet. Not anymore. By nightfall, local news had picked up the incident. A black man falsely arrested in a small Tennessee town, then revealed to be a high-ranking federal prosecutor. It was a headline too big to ignore. And in the era of social media, it didn't take long for the footage to spread beyond the borders of Eagles Crossing. The courtroom whispers became news clips. The news clips became viral posts. Justice for Mercer started trending. Elijah's inbox filled up fast calls from national journalists, civil rights organizations, even colleagues from the DOJ asking what had happened. His story wasn't just his anymore. It was public now, a flashpoint in the long, hard fight against injustice. Meanwhile, Officer Bradley Kane sat in the eye of the storm. Kane had been suspended from duty within hours of the hearing. The sheriff's office had to make a show of doing something, even if they hadn't admitted fault. Kane's patrol car sat parked in front of his modest home on Oak Drive, the paint dull, the lights cold and silent. Inside, he watched the news roll in from his living room, the anchor's words sharp as glass. Elijah Mercer, a federal prosecutor, was wrongfully detained by Officer Bradley Kane of Eagles Crossing on false charges. The incident has sparked outrage from civil rights leaders across the nation. Kane's fist clenched around the beer can in his hand, his knuckles turning white. "They're making me the villain," he muttered under his breath, "making me out to be some monster." But deep down, even Kane knew the truth. He'd felt it the moment Mercer flashed that badge, the moment the courtroom had turned against him. This wasn't going away quietly. Sheriff Linda Rowe wasn't happy either. At 52, she'd worked hard to keep Eagles Crossing out of the spotlight, to keep things running the way they always had. The daughter of the former sheriff, she'd inherited not just the badge, but the unspoken understanding of how power worked in this town. But now her town was on every news feed in America. She called Kane into her office the next day. His uniform hung loose without his badge, his face worn from a sleepless night. "You know what you've done?" Rowe hissed, slamming her hand on the desk. "You've brought the whole damn world down on us." Kane stared at the floor, jaw clenched. "He's just another one of them," Kane snapped. "Thought he could walk through here like he owned the place." Rowe leaned back, eyes sharp, and now he does. But even as Kane sat suspended, the gears of Eagles Crossing turned behind closed doors. Sheriff Rowe wasn't about to roll over and let a man like Elijah Mercer burn down her house, not without a fight. Rumors started spreading through the town's gossip network at Dolly's Diner over morning coffee, at the barbershop where old men gathered to discuss the world's problems. Kane's defenders, the locals who shared his views but never spoke them aloud, began muttering on front porches and in barbershops. Mercer was probably stirring trouble. You know how those city folks are. It didn't take much to stoke those fires. The same system that had protected Kane for years was still there, smoldering beneath the surface. But Elijah was busy doing what he did, best building a case. He stayed in town, booking a room at the small, no-frills Pinewood Motel on the edge of town. The place smelled of old carpet and cigarette smoke, but it gave him the space he needed to work. His laptop sat open on the desk, case files spread out around him like a roadmap to injustice. His phone buzzed non-stop with calls from reporters and DOJ colleagues, but Elijah ignored most of them. He wasn't here for the headlines. He was here for justice. He began digging into Kane, into the Eagles Crossing Police Department, into every dark corner this town had tried to keep hidden. And what he found, it wasn't surprising, but it was worse than he'd expected. Records of racial profiling stretching back years. Cases dropped without reason. Complaints from Black and Latino residents swept under the rug. 12 specific complaints against Kane in the past 5 years from people of color, all mysteriously marked resolved with no disciplinary action, no body cams, no accountability. No oversight beyond Sheriff Rowe, who seemed to sign off on everything without question. It was a system designed to protect itself, and it had worked until now. Elijah compiled everything, building a narrative brick by brick. Every document, every complaint, every piece of evidence became part of the story he was going to tell. But Cain and Rowe weren't going down without a fight. The threats started coming almost as soon as Elijah began poking around anonymous calls in the middle of the night, breathing on the other end of the line. Slashed tires on his rental car, discovered one morning as he was heading out to interview another witness. A Molotov cocktail thrown at the edge of the motel parking lot, close enough to send a message but far enough not to burn anything down. Elijah didn't flinch. He'd faced down cartel leaders and corrupt senators. He'd gone up against men with more power and less conscience than Cain or Rowe could ever dream of. And this was personal, because it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every black man or woman who'd been stopped for fitting the description. Every person who'd been silenced by the weight of a badge backed by a broken system. Elijah sat at that motel desk, staring at the glowing screen, watching as the pieces came together. Outside, the town simmered, caught between the weight of its history and the light of exposure. Officer Cain thought he could bury the story. But Elijah Mercer was about to prove that truth doesn't die that easy. Part 5. Depths of Corruption. The deeper Elijah Mercer dug, the darker the roots of Eagles Crossing grew. At first glance, it was just another small town with its rows of weathered storefronts and faded American flags fluttering beneath Tennessee skies. But beneath that quiet, beneath those familiar handshakes and Sunday morning smiles, there was a system built to protect people like Officer Bradley Cain and to crush anyone who dared to question it. Elijah had seen it before: the quiet deals made behind closed doors, the phone calls that never showed up in any log, the evidence that somehow always went missing when the wrong person got too close. But this wasn't Washington, D.C. This wasn't Capitol Hill or some boardroom full of lobbyists. This was deeper than politics. This was generational. He sat in that motel room night after night, a cheap lamp buzzing overhead, files spread across the bed like puzzle pieces, complaint records, arrest logs, disciplinary actions, or more often than not, bullies across the bed like puzzle pieces. The lack of them, names repeated over and over. Cain's name showed up more times than Elijah could count, attached to incidents that never went anywhere. No further investigation. Case closed, insufficient evidence, but the pattern was there. It wasn't just Cain. It was the entire structure holding him up: Sheriff Linda Rowe, the town council, even Judge Thomas Holloway, who sat behind the bench the day Elijah was dragged into that courtroom. They were all connected, all part of the same machine. And the machine wasn't just flawed, it was rigged. On a Tuesday morning, 3 days into his investigation, Elijah found something that made his blood run cold. A police report from 2018: a young black man named Marcus Johnson, age 22, stopped by Cain for suspicious behavior. The report claimed Johnson resisted arrest, reaching for Cain's weapon. Cain fired 3 shots. Johnson died on the scene. The investigation, overseen by Sheriff Rowe herself, cleared Cain of all wrongdoing in less than a week. No witnesses interviewed, no dashcam footage preserved. Case closed. Johnson's mother filed a complaint, then a lawsuit. It was dismissed by Judge Holloway due to lack of evidence. The mother moved away from Eagles Crossing 3 months later. Elijah made quiet calls to colleagues in the DOJ, to civil rights lawyers he trusted, to journalists who knew how to follow the scent of corruption. They helped him piece together the broader picture: campaign donations that traced back to police unions and local developers, a web of money flowing in and out of Eagles Crossing, greasing the wheels for people like Cain to do whatever they pleased. But that wasn't enough. Elijah needed more. He needed something undeniable, so he went out into the town. He knocked on doors. Black families, Latino families, the ones who lived in the parts of Eagles Crossing no tourist ever wandered into. He listened to their stories about being pulled over for no reason, about being searched, questioned, harassed, sometimes beaten, always fitting the description, always being told they were lucky to get off easy. One woman, Mrs. Livebee's Helen Carter, a retired schoolteacher, sat with him at her kitchen table, her hands trembling as she recounted how her grandson had been dragged out of his car at gunpoint by Cain 2 years back. The charges? Nothing. The reason? He looked suspicious. Helen never filed a complaint. Why would she? She'd seen what happened when people pushed back. She'd seen how quickly the system closed ranks. "They own this town," she whispered, her eyes darting to the window as if Kane might be listening. Always have. Elijah recorded every word with their permission. Every story became part of the case he was building, not just against Kane, but against Eagles Crossing itself. And as those stories piled up, so did the pressure. The sheriff's department knew Elijah wasn't going away. Word got back to Sheriff Rowe that Mercer was stirring things up, digging where he wasn't welcome. She called an emergency meeting with the town council, desperate to find a way to shut him down. But it was too late. The spotlight was already on. The media came in waves. First local reporters, then regional outlets, then national news trucks parked outside the courthouse, cameras rolling. Anchors standing in front of the building that for decades had been a fortress for injustice. Sheriff Rowe tried to hold a press conference, tried to spin the story about Kane's suspension, about how the department was cooperating fully with federal authorities, but the questions kept coming. What about the complaints going back 10 years? Why were there no investigations? What do you have to say to the families? Rowe's practiced smile faltered beneath the weight of those cameras. But the real blow came from Elijah himself. He held his own press conference podium, no security detail, just him standing on the courthouse steps, holding a stack of files thick with the town's dirty laundry. "This is more than just one officer," Elijah told the crowd, his voice cutting through the chatter. "This is a system designed to protect itself at the expense of the people it's supposed to serve." He laid out the evidence for everyone to see, case after case, story after story, a trail of injustice stretching back years, all leading back to Kane and those who covered for him. "Marcus Johnson deserves justice," Elijah said, his voice strong as he held up the photo of a young man who would never grow older. "So does every person who's been silenced by this department." And people listened. Protests started small, with just a handful of residents with signs outside the sheriff's department, but they grew fast. By the end of the week, dozens stood shoulder to shoulder, chanting for accountability, holding up names, faces, stories that had been buried too long. Sheriff Rowe locked down the station, called in reinforcements from neighboring towns. But the more they pushed back, the louder the crowd grew. And Kainahé stayed holed up in his house, blinds drawn, the blue and red lights of police cruisers parked outside like a fortress. His suspension had turned into paid administrative leave, a fact that only fueled the protests further. They protect their own, the chants went. No justice, no peace. But even in hiding, Kane wasn't done. Elijah received his first death threat a few days later, and an envelope slid under the door of his motel room, no return address. Inside was a photo of him walking through town, circled in red ink. No words, none needed. He showed it to the FBI agents who had finally been brought in to monitor the case. But even they couldn't pin it down. No fingerprints, no cameras, no trail. It was a warning, but Elijah didn't scare easily. He'd faced threats before, real ones, from cartels, from corrupt politicians. He knew how this game worked, and he knew exactly what to do next. With the help of a trusted journalist from Nashville, Elijah began preparing to release the full report, damning, unfiltered account of what Eagles Crossing had allowed to grow unchecked for years. It would be broadcast nationally. Everyone would see, because the truth was the only weapon that couldn't be silenced. Elijah Mercer wasn't here for revenge. He was here for justice. And justice, once it starts rolling, is a force no one can stop. Part 6. The Fire Rises. The town of Eagles Crossing had never felt smaller. Streets that once seemed wide open now felt like narrow alleys closing in with every passing day. Elijah Mercer's investigation wasn't just shaking the walls of the sheriff's department. It was cracking the very foundation the town stood on. And the people who had built that foundation were getting nervous. At first, it was just the sideways glances of people watching Elijah a little too long when he passed by the diner, the hardware store, the church steps. The polite smiles that once greeted strangers in town, gone, replaced with muttered words and clenched jaws. But the real threats didn't hide behind polite glances. Late one night, just as Elijah was reviewing another stack of case files in his motel room, there was a sound outside, sharp, sudden, glass shattering. His heart jumped, the kind of reflex you never quite lose no matter how many years you've spent in courtrooms instead of war zones. He rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain just in time to see the tail end of a shadow disappear down the street. On the pavement below, shards of glass from a bottle scattered across the sidewalk. The smell of gasoline hung in the air, a Molotov cocktail that hadn't hit the building, but had been close enough to send the message. Elijah stood there, breathing deep, steadying the pulse pounding in his ears. He grabbed his phone, snapped a picture of the wreckage, and forwarded it to the FBI contact assigned to his case, but he already knew how this would play out. The story was the same in towns like this. The sheriff would feign concern, the town council would issue some hollow statement about unacceptable behavior, but no arrests would follow, no suspects identified. Just a quiet shrug and an unspoken warning, back off. But Elijah Mercer didn't know how to back off. The next morning, he found the tires of his rental car slashed, all four. The sun was barely up, the streets still quiet, but someone had done it in the night, right outside his motel. They weren't hiding anymore. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, surveying the damage like it was another puzzle to solve. The motel clerk peeked out from behind the front desk window, but when Elijah caught his eye, the man quickly turned away. That was the thing about towns like Eagles Crossing. Even the people who weren't involved knew when to keep their heads down. Elijah called in the vandalism, waited for the report that would probably never make it past the sheriff's trash bin, and walked back to his room. The files waited for him, scattered across the bed, the weight of injustice printed on every page. But this wasn't just about paper trails anymore. This was personal. Sheriff Rowe knew exactly what was happening. She could pretend all she wanted that the department wasn't involved, that the harassment wasn't coming from her people. But Elijah could see it in her eyes, the way she avoided him now, the way her voice cracked just a little when reporters shoved microphones in her face. "We are conducting a full internal investigation," she'd say, the words hollow as an empty promise. Officer Kane's actions are not representative of this department, but they were, and everyone knew it. The town was starting to split right down the middle. On one side were the families who had stayed quiet for too long, the ones Elijah had met in kitchens and living rooms, telling stories they never thought would matter. They stood a little taller now, marched alongside the growing crowds outside the courthouse, holding signs that spoke the truth no one wanted to hear. Justice for Marcus Johnson, Eagles Crossing. Stop the Hate Kane is not the only one. On the other side, the old guard, the ones who saw Elijah Mercer as the threat, the outsider, the man coming into their town and pulling back the curtain. They didn't care that he was a federal prosecutor. All they saw was a black man shining a light where they wanted darkness. Elijah kept working every day, digging deeper, filing reports, lining up witness statements, building a case that was no longer just about Officer Kane. It was about the whole rotten system that had protected him. But with every step forward, the threats grew darker. The next message didn't come as broken glass or slashed tires. It came as a phone call with no caller ID, the kind of number that traces back to nowhere. Elijah picked up, expecting silence, but instead a low, gravelly voice spoke. "You're not welcome here, Mercer. Turn around." Before we make you disappear, there was a pause, the faintest sound of breathing on the other end. "You think the law is going to save you out here? You don't know this town." Then the line went dead. Elijah stared at the phone, his pulse steady, his jaw set. He'd heard threats before from cartel bosses, from gang leaders, from politicians who thought they were untouchable. This was no different. And yet, it was because this wasn't just about him. It wasn't about politics or power plays in Washington. This was about a town clinging to the last threads of its broken legacy. About people who would rather burn it all down than admit the system was wrong. The FBI offered to pull him out, relocate him, put him in a hotel 3 towns over until the investigation wrapped. But Elijah refused. "I'm not leaving," he told them, his voice firm. "They want me gone, and I'm staying right here, because leaving wasn't an option." Backing down meant the people who threw that Molotov cocktail, the ones who slashed his tires, the voice on that phone, they would win. And every person who stood outside that courthouse holding signs telling their stories, they would lose, and that was unacceptable. Elijah stayed, and the town held its breath, waiting for the next move. Part 7. The Breaking Point Eagles Crossing slept uneasily that night. The streets were quiet. But beneath the stillness, something dark stirred. The air felt thick, like it carried the weight of the town's history, the kind that didn't get written down in history books but lived in whispers and threats. Elijah Mercer stood at the edge of that history, staring out his hotel window at the empty parking lot, knowing it wouldn't stay empty for long. His phone buzzed again after another call from the DOJ. More offers to pull him out, to relocate him to somewhere safer until things cooled off. But Elijah didn't answer. He let the phone ring out the same way he had every time since the threat started coming. Because the truth was simply leaving wasn't an option. Not now. The files spread across the motel bed were more than just paperwork. They were stories. Real people, real lives chewed up by a system that had been left to rot for too long. And Elijah knew the only way forward was straight through the fire. But the fire was coming for him faster than he expected. It was past midnight when it happened. He was still at the desk, cross-referencing arrest records, when a sharp sound outside broke the silence. Tires screeching, a low growl of an engine revving hard. Elijah froze for just a second, then moved fast, pulling the curtain back just enough to see headlights cut across the parking lot. The cruiser wasn't marked, but Elijah didn't need a badge to recognize a predator. Officer Bradley Kane sat behind the wheel, his buzz cut barely visible beneath the glow of the dashboard. His jaw was set, eyes locked on Elijah's window like he could see straight through the curtain. The engine rumbled low a warning more than a greeting. Elijah stared back, unflinching, and then the door of the cruiser swung open. Kane stepped out, one hand resting on the grip of his holstered sidearm, the other clutching something else, a folded piece of paper. Elijah stepped out onto the lot before Kane could reach the door. "I'm not hard to find, officer," Elijah said calmly. Kane stopped a few feet away, the corners of his mouth curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. He held out the paper, letting it flutter in the breeze. "Search warrant," he muttered, "signed by Judge Holloway." Elijah took the paper, barely glancing at the signature. Holloway, the same judge who'd sat silent through the first hearing, who'd turned a blind eye to Kane's lies. Another cog in the machine. "What are you searching for?" Elijah asked, voice level. Kane's smirk grew wider. "We got a tip," he said, eyes narrowing with a mockery of concern. "Said you might be in possession of evidence from an ongoing federal case. Thought maybe you're holding on to something you shouldn't be." Elijah folded the paper, slipping it into his jacket pocket. "You're reaching." Kane stepped closer, boots crunching against the gravel. "Maybe," he said, "but I've got the paper." Elijah stayed rooted, the motel lights casting long shadows between them. He knew the play here. This wasn't about finding anything. It was about sending a message. "You know this is retaliation," Elijah said. "Calm as still water." Kane shrugged. "It's a procedure." With that, Kane motioned for two deputies to join him. Fresh faces, younger men, eyes darting nervously as they approached the motel room. They moved fast, flipping through his files, rifling through drawers, pulling apart the neat stacks of documents Elijah had spent weeks assembling. And when they couldn't find what they were looking for, they planted it. One deputy, a thin man with shaky hands, pulled a flash drive from his pocket, sliding it under a stack of papers on the desk. Kane stood back, arms crossed, watching. "You want to explain this?" Kane asked, his voice dripping with mock concern as he picked up the flash drive and waved it in front of Elijah's face. Elijah didn't blink. "You're framing me?" Kane's smile thinned, his eyes narrowing. "That's a hell of an accusation." Elijah's voice dropped low, steady as steel. "I've seen your kind before. You think you can bury me with a planted flash drive and a signed warrant. But this isn't going to end the way you think." Kane's jaw tightened. "We'll see." The deputies cuffed Elijah again, this time rougher than before. His wrists burned as the steel bit into his skin, but he didn't resist. He let them parade him out of the motel room, past the gawking onlookers gathering in the lot, neighbors peeking from windows, motel guests filming on their phones. By the time Elijah was dragged into the back of Kane's cruiser, the video had already hit social media. Another arrest, another headline. But this wasn't the same story, because Elijah Mercer wasn't just a black man in cuffs. He was a federal prosecutor, and this time, the whole world was watching. They booked him into the same holding cell, the concrete walls cold against his back. Kane leaned against the bars, smirking like he'd won. "You're not untouchable," Kane said, his voice low. Elijah met his gaze, steady and unbroken. "Neither are you." Hours dragged by in that cell, but Elijah's mind never stopped moving. He thought about the flash drive, the warrant, the staged raid. Kane wasn't acting alone. Sheriff Rowe was behind this, maybe even higher. Someone had given the order to take him down. But Elijah wasn't the only one fighting. Outside, the protests swelled again. What started as a few dozen voices turned into hundreds marching through the streets of Eagles Crossing, their signs bold, their chants louder than ever. Justice for Mercer. No more cover-ups. The pressure mounted, and the cracks in the town's facade began to show. News anchors reported live from the courthouse steps. Journalists dug deeper into the police department's history. Stories that had been buried for years were unearthed, given air for the first time. And then came the turning point. An anonymous whistleblower leaked body cam footage from the raid on Elijah's motel room. The video showed the deputy planting the flash drive, clear as day. One of Kane's own men, perhaps the young officer with the shaky hands, had flipped, unable to stomach what they'd been ordered to do. The footage spread like wildfire, played on every major news outlet. The truth was out. Kane's smirk vanished overnight. Sheriff Rowe scrambled to contain the fallout, but it was too late. The DOJ launched a full-scale investigation into the Eagles Crossing Police Department. Federal agents swept through the station, seizing files, pulling records, and Elijah walked free again. Bruised, tired, but not broken. Standing on the courthouse steps, looking out at the sea of supporters, Elijah raised his voice. They tried to bury the truth, he said, the words carrying across the crowd. But the truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. The crowd roared, and for the first time in a long time, Eagles Crossing shook not from fear, but from the sound of change coming. Part 8. Judgment Day. Eagles Crossing had always been a place that thrived on silence. The kind of silence where injustices slipped through the cracks, unspoken, buried beneath polite nods and church hymns. But not anymore. The cracks were splitting wide open, and for the first time, the whole world could hear what had been hiding beneath. Elijah Mercer stood on the courthouse steps, suit rumpled from another night spent chasing justice, but his posture steady, his voice calm. The protests outside had grown from a handful of locals into a movement. Hundreds of people filled the square, their signs lifted high, their voices loud enough to rattle the windows of the sheriff's department. Justice for Mercer, no more cover-ups, Black Lives Matter in Eagles Crossing. And in the center of it all stood Elijah, a symbol of what happens when the system tries to crush the wrong man. But this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the town, about the people whose stories had gone unheard for too long. Elijah had their stories now written down, recorded piece by piece, building the case against Officer Kane and the entire rotten structure that held him up. Inside the courthouse, Kane sat at the defense table, flanked by his attorney, an old friend of the sheriff's, the kind of lawyer who built his career defending the status quo. Kane's face was flushed, his jaw set, but the smirk he once wore like a shield had long since faded. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back rows, their cameras trained on every movement. Locals filled the gallery, some there in support, others just to see how it would all play out. Sheriff Rowe sat near the front, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes flicking nervously from Kane to the judge. This wasn't the same Judge Thomas Holloway who had presided over Elijah's first appearance. No, that judge had quietly recused himself after the DOJ opened its investigation, citing personal reasons that everyone knew were just a thin cover for self-preservation. This new judge's federal appointee, with no ties to Eagles Crossing, no loyalty to its old ways, looked out over the packed courtroom with a face that stayed hard, unreadable. Mr. Place. Mercer, the judge, called from the bench. Please approach. Elijah stood, adjusting his tie, and walked to the front of the courtroom. His steps were steady, deliberate. He didn't carry a folder of papers or a stack of files. He didn't need to. The evidence was already on the record: body cam footage, planted evidence, testimony from whistleblowers. But today was about something more. The judge leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. Mr. Mercer, do you wish to make a statement before these proceedings continue? Elijah met his gaze, nodded once, then turned to face the courtroom. The cameras caught his every move, the lights hot on his face, but his voice didn't waver. I do. He took a breath, grounding himself in the weight of what was to come. I've spent my life in courtrooms like this, Elijah began, his voice echoing through the chamber. I've seen justice served, and I've seen it denied. But never, not once, have I seen a town so deeply committed to burying the truth as I have here in Eagle's Crossing. A murmur rippled through the gallery, but Elijah pressed on. For years, this department has operated without accountability. For years, men like Officer Kane have used their badge as a weapon not to protect, but to intimidate, to control. And for years, this town let it happen. He turned his gaze directly toward Kane, eyes sharp. You thought I was just another man to be silenced, another life you could crush under the weight of your authority, but I'm still here. The courtroom fell silent. Elijah straightened his back, lifting his chin. And I'm not the only one. He gestured toward the gallery, where faces stared back at him. People who had once kept their heads down, now standing tall. Mothers who had watched their sons harassed. Fathers who had been stopped one too many times. Neighbors who had whispered in kitchens, afraid to speak aloud. The people of this town have had enough, Elijah continued, his voice steady but charged with emotion. And now the whole world is watching. The judge nodded, motioning for Elijah to return to his seat. The silence lingered, heavy with the weight of Elijah's words. The prosecution laid out the case next to every detail, every fact stitched together into a tapestry of misconduct and corruption. Body cam footage showing the planted flash drive. Testimony from the deputy who came forward, confessing how Kane pressured him to lie. Reports of racial profiling, complaints buried in filing cabinets that hadn't seen daylight in years. Kane's attorney tried to fight back. He argued about procedure, about technicalities, about Kane's good service and dedication to the community. But the words rang hollow not after the footage, not after the testimonies, not after the whole world had seen what Eagle's Crossing had tried to hide. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The judge called Kane to the stand. Kane hesitated. His lawyer leaned in, whispering fast, but the judge's voice cut through the courtroom. Officer Kane, you are required to testify. Slowly, Kane stood, his movement stiff. He took the stand, swore his oath, and sat down, eyes fixed on a spot just above the judge's head. The prosecutor began, Officer Kane, do you deny planting evidence against Mr. Mercer? Kane's jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line. I don't recall doing that, he muttered. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. You don't recall? Even though we have video footage showing you instructing your deputy to plant the flash drive? Kane's face flushed, but he said nothing. The prosecutor leaned in. You can't deny the truth, officer. It's right there for everyone to see. Kane's hands clenched the edge of the witness stand, knuckles white. And then, almost too soft to hear, he spoke. I was following orders. The courtroom gasped. Even Kane's lawyer froze, unprepared for this admission. Orders from whom? The prosecutor pressed. Kane hesitated, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. His eyes flicked toward Sheriff Rowe, who sat frozen, her face pale. From Sheriff Rowe, Kane finally said, voice barely above a whisper. The room erupted. The judge slammed his gavel, calling for order, but it was too late. The floodgates had opened. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Protesters outside cheered as word spread. The case against Kane had just become the case against Sheriff Rowe. The judge called a recess, but the damage was done. Rowe's face was splashed across every newsfeed, her name tied to a conspiracy of corruption and abuse of power. The DOJ widened its investigation, and federal agents moved in on the sheriff's department, seizing records, making arrests. Elijah stood outside the courthouse, watching as the walls of Eagle's Crossing finally began to crumble. He felt the weight of it all, the exhaustion, the scars, the long fight, but he stood tall. This wasn't the end, but it was the turning point. Part 9, the aftermath. When the gavel struck the bench for the final time, it felt like something inside Eagle's Crossing cracked open. The courtroom was quiet, too quiet for the weight of what had just unfolded. Officer Bradley Kane had confessed. Sheriff Linda Rowe sat frozen, her name now tangled in a conspiracy that reached further than anyone in that small town had dared to imagine. And Elijah Mercer stood at the center of it all, not as a victim, but as the man who'd refused to be silenced. The press swarmed the courthouse steps as the proceedings ended. Microphones thrust into Elijah's face, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing like lightning. But Elijah didn't speak. Not yet. He stood there for a moment, letting the town soak in what had happened. The people gathered outside, some holding protest signs, others just watching in stunned silence, knew they had witnessed history. The cracks in the system weren't just showing anymore. They were wide open. Federal agents moved quickly. The DOJ wasted no time issuing orders. Sheriff Rowe was placed under immediate investigation, her badge and gun stripped away in a cold procedural moment that felt nothing short of monumental. Officers under her command, the ones who'd stayed silent all these years, were suspended pending review. The Sheriff's Department, a fortress of unchecked power for decades, was no longer untouchable, and Kainahé was done. His badge was revoked, his reputation shredded beyond repair. His confession, caught on video, played across every major network, was the final nail in his career. He left the courthouse in handcuffs, head down, no longer the man who once strutted through the streets of Eagles Crossing with unchecked authority. But even as justice felt close enough to touch, Elijah knew the fight wasn't over. Because justice isn't a one-time thing. It's not a single courtroom victory or a headline flashing across the evening news. Justice is a process, a grind. And for every Cain and Roe brought down, there were more hiding in the shadows, waiting for the world to turn its back again. That night, as the town settled into the unfamiliar quiet of accountability, Elijah sat outside his motel, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The protests had quieted, but their echoes still filled the air. He'd stayed longer than he planned, longer than anyone thought he would, but leaving now didn't feel right. His phone buzzed. Another call from the DOJ, this time not to warn him off, but to thank him, to tell him the department was moving in. Those reforms were on the table: body cameras, independent oversight, training protocols. All the words you hear after something breaks. But Elijah had heard those words before. In other towns, in other cases, they were promises, not guarantees. And the people of Eagles Crossing had earned more than promises. Elijah took a slow breath, looking out over the quiet streets, the same streets where he'd been dragged into a cruiser, handcuffed, humiliated. He thought of the people he'd met here. Helen Carter, the retired school teacher who'd first opened her door to him, shared her grandson's story. The families who'd lined up outside the courthouse, their voices louder than the hate trying to drown them out. This wasn't just about tearing down the old, it was about building something new. The next morning, Elijah stood on the courthouse steps one last time. No cameras, no reporters, just him and the people of Eagles Crossing. The ones who had marched, who had spoken out, who had risked everything to see justice done. He raised his voice, not for the headlines, but for them. "This fight wasn't about me," Elijah began, his voice steady, echoing off the brick walls. "This was about every person in this town who's been silenced. Every family that's carried the weight of injustice without anyone to listen." The small crowd stood quietly, listening. Some nodded, some wiped away tears. "We took a stand together," Elijah continued. "We forced the world to look to see what happens when power goes unchecked. And now we have the chance to make sure it never happens again." He paused, letting the words settle. "This town has the chance to rebuild, to hold every badge, every office, every courtroom to the standard the people deserve. But that fight doesn't stop today." He stepped down from the courthouse steps, walking through the crowd, shaking hands, sharing quiet words with the people who had stood beside him. Because this was their victory, too. As Elijah packed his things later that day, folding up the files, the evidence, the weight of months spent fighting, he knew he was leaving something behind. But it wasn't unfinished business. It was a legacy. He'd come to Eagles Crossing as a target. He left as a symbol, not because he was a federal prosecutor, not because the DOJ had his back, but because he stood his ground. Because he refused to let them bury the truth, and that truth changed everything. As he drove out of town, the sun rising over the Tennessee hills, Elijah glanced back once. The courthouse still stood there, weathered and worn, but different now. Its walls had held secrets for too long. Now they held something else. They held the memory of what happens when the right person stands up at the right time and refuses to back down. The fight for justice doesn't end here. It never does. But for Eagles Crossing, this was a beginning, conclusion. Sometimes life reminds us that the fight for justice is never finished. It's passed down generation to generation. What happened in Eagles Crossing teaches us something powerful. Silence protects no one. When people like Elijah Mercer stand up even when the system tries to break them, they light a path for others to follow. For those of us who've lived long enough to see how the world can turn a blind eye, this story reminds us that change doesn't come easy, but it comes when we refuse to back down. It's a call to keep asking the hard questions, to keep holding those in power accountable, and to never forget that our voices, no matter our age, still matter, because the greatest victories aren't the ones we win for ourselves. They're the ones we win for the next generation. So whether you're marching in the streets or simply sharing a story that needs to be heard, you are part of the fight for a better tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who believes in standing for what's right, no matter the cost. Together, we can keep these stories alive.